Chapter 11 Darkness on the Edge of Bed. The TIAC Model 144 Portastudio brings top quality creative recording capabilities within the reach of the home studio enthusiast and serious musician/engineer with unprecedented economy and portability. From the TIAC 144 User's Manual. Laughing, Springsteen described the Colts Neck recording room as lightly furnished. It was his bedroom. When I asked why, with other rooms available, he would record in the bedroom, he hesitated, as if he hadn't stopped to consider that. You know, I lived there by myself, and it was a relatively small house. I'm sure there was a guest bedroom somewhere, but this was just where I was comfortable. I'm sitting on the end of my bed and singing and playing. It was beyond casual. I put the mic up there, and this was where I'd usually sit and sing, the end of my bed. The microphone he was singing into was connected to a TIAC 144 4-track recorder. He'd sent his roadie, Mike Batlin, to pick up a machine he could use at home to make demos. Batlin grabbed a TIAC 144 at what the manufacturer would later describe as nothing more than a local music store. Coupling that with a few Shure SM57 microphones, affordable workhorse microphones, Springsteen had his home studio. Batlin looked at the 144's manual, apparently not for long, and got Springsteen far enough that the songwriter could begin cutting tracks and doing the few overdubs the 144 would allow. The multi-tracking capacity of the machine would allow Springsteen to layer some musical elements over his basic voice guitar tracks. He could, if he chose, even create the sound of a small combo, but that wasn't what he was after. It would be the sound of one man. The arrival of the TIAC 144, priced at $899 retail, meant multi-track recording could be done on a cassette. It was still a new technology, a novelty. You could buy your recording tape at a convenience store, 10 good cassettes for $20 or so. To increase the quality of the recording, TIAC doubled the tape speed from that of a normal consumer cassette recorder, from 1/7/8 inches per second IPS to 3 3/4 IPS. Professional recording machines, the kind Springsteen had used when making albums, were a different matter altogether. One reel of tape cost around $50, and if it had been put in casing like a cassette, it would have been about as thick as a standard dictionary. Those professional machines sent the tape over the recording heads at a speed almost 10 times faster than the TIAC 144. More tape over the recording heads meant better quality. All that said, the TIAC 144 was still the first major bid to establish a territory between studio-grade recording gear and the cassette recorders the kids played with. The revolution of the 4-track cassette recorder really was this: multi-track recording could be done at home. If in the moment it was a quiet development, it was nonetheless a landmark in the larger story of recording. The user's manual for the TIAC 144 made it sound, well, better than it was. Top quality recording capabilities, the manual promised, for the serious musician/engineer. It was a promise made by people with a product to sell. The 144 was not a machine for musicians looking to make hit records. At most, for that class of artist, it was a tool. The cassette technology situated the machine in the world of the consumer, and beyond that, the musician's work tape. The Maxell cassettes Springsteen pushed into the 144 were the same ones he'd used when he recorded rehearsals with the E Street Band. Cassette players were extremely important for us, recalled Steven Van Zandt. We'd put a cassette recorder in the middle of rehearsal to tape it. In those days, for a certain amount of time, there was a self-limiter on the microphone, so it wouldn't distort. You could play as a full rock band, full volume, and it would sound incredible on a cassette player. It was the sound Keith Richards and Charlie Watts got on Street Fighting Man, recorded in a hotel room on a cheap Philips recorder, the kind that could be picked up at a London department store. We'd go into the recording studio, Van Zandt continued, and we'd have to try to get this sound, the one we got on a $20 cassette recorder. So it was a major part of everybody's life in those days, because that's how you recorded your rehearsals or ideas you had for songs. You can't beat that sound. It's just a fantastic sound. The cheap devices using cassette tape had a special quality, the warmth of magnetic tape, the rich sound of tape saturation, all colored by built-in limiting/compression. What Van Zandt describes, however, was not multi-track recording. It was one-track mono recording, put down on a cassette, the tape width roughly 1/8 of an inch as opposed to the 2 inches for professional tape. But when Springsteen got the TEAC 144 going, which was a multi-track machine, he was ripping the plastic off a fresh Maxell and thinking of the loose, on-the-fly world of rehearsals and work tapes, not of commercial recordings intended for release. Bruce had gotten this 4-track cassette player, recalled Van Zandt, laughing, which was highly evolved technologically from our usual mono 1-track. And I guess, I don't know, he was doing demos for what would become Born in the USA eventually. And he just did them with his roadie, his guitar roadie, working the dials and keeping it from distorting or whatever. And he did a bunch of these things. The guy known for laboring over Born to Run, Darkness on the Edge of Town, The River, a legend in second-guessing himself and perfectionism, wasn't getting in his own way because he didn't know he was making an album. Springsteen. I mean, it wasn't produced. I don't know if there's even a recording credit. I don't think there's any engineering credit. Warren Zanes. Mike Batlin got a recording credit. Springsteen. Did he? Damn, that's good. It was just an undone record. None of those skills came into play. Consciously into play, let's say. They were unmanned positions. In the first few years that followed the TEAC 144's introduction, it was common enough to hear people, particularly the aspirational types who had just picked up their new 144s, say the Beatles made Sgt. Pepper's on a 4-track. While true, the Beatles sure as hell weren't using a TEAC 144. The 4-track machines at Abbey Road, which to this day remain coveted by artists and producers, were studio grade, using 1-inch tape and operating at significantly higher tape speeds than the 144. The microphones used were of equal quality, no comparison with the Shure 57s Springsteen was using. And by Sgt. Pepper's, the Beatles were syncing 2 machines together in order to have more tracks. No one should have felt disappointed that their 144 demos didn't sound like fixing a hole. What the 144 user's manual didn't say, because the makers of the machine didn't know this, nor did anyone else at the time, was that the TEAC 144 would mark the beginning of a home recording revolution that would eventually prove a significant threat to commercial studios. While being an analog, tape-based machine, the TEAC 144 was a step toward a digital age when multi-track recording of a much higher quality could be done on most laptops, not to mention what could be achieved with the various standalone units and software programs that would become available for home use. By the start of the 21st century, artists wouldn't need the commercial studios to nearly the same degree that they had in prior decades. People could and would make hit records at home on a regular basis. But in terms of quality, an early device like the TEAC 144 was still far closer to that $20 cassette recorder than it was to the equipment at costly studios like the Hit Factory and the Power Station. Toby Scott would work on Springsteen projects from 1978 through 2017, often exclusively. As an engineer, he had his own view of the effects on recorded music as artists began to do more and more recording in home studios. The introduction of the home capability, Scott asked, pausing before answering his own question, I was always like, this is not going to be good. The TEAC 144 was just the beginning. What's happening now is that anyone can do it. Make something with GarageBand. People can record at home. That drummer, Gary Malabar, who played on Lucky Town, I saw him 2 weeks ago, and he'd gotten back from Nashville. He said, it's changed. There's a few big studios, but everybody's working at home. To a certain extent, what's happening is that, yeah, everybody's recording at home, but the regular guy that has no recording instruction, who has no basis to understand what a recording could be, is acting as the engineer. So people record stuff like Bruce, and with the latest digital version of something like his Nebraska technology. But of course, Springsteen wasn't making a record. These songs had been in my head and on paper for a bit, still kind of evolving, even if they were sometimes close, Springsteen insisted. The recordings, though, were just meant to get us a jump start on work in the studio with the band. I'd always spent a lot of time writing in the studio. I was trying to be more efficient, I guess. Certainly trying to spend a little less money. Writing songs in a commercial recording studio is a little like storing your winter clothes in a room at the Four Seasons. It gets costly. Springsteen knew what it was like to be a rock and roll star carrying a load of debt. Maybe he was getting too old for that. What works in your 20s doesn't always make the same sense rounding the corner the next decade. So he figured he'd work some stuff out at home, then finish it in the studio, saving himself a nice sack of cash. I certainly didn't spend long recording it, I was putting things down only as a kind of reference. Once Batlin set up the TEAC 144, Springsteen, unencumbered, got right to work. By most accounts, the night of January 3rd, 1982, was the session that captured the bulk of the Nebraska recordings. Batlin was there and not there. He gave me a gift of helping without being a presence, was kind of invisible, Springsteen recalled. I felt alone, and I needed that for these songs. As far as instruments went, the leading role in the making of Nebraska was played by Springsteen's acoustic guitar. A J200, a Gibson, he told me, asking me to wait where I was while he went to get it. Back moments later, with the guitar in hand, he showed me the instrument, letting the afternoon sun play across its surface as only a guitar player can do, before setting it down in its own seat, next to the portrait of his Aunt Virginia. I believe this too was a gift from Mike Batlin, he told me. The Gibson J200 is a guitar that has some stories of its own and brought the right kind of past to Nebraska. It's the model Ike Everly played around the time his sons Phil and Don were teenagers in Ike's family band, a radio act. The boys learned to love the J200, later getting their own, and finally from Gibson, the smaller body versions that would be their signature Everly Brothers guitars. Elvis and Neil Diamond, George Harrison and Jimmy Page, Emmylou Harris, all have had J200s within reach. The electric guitar used on the album was the Born to Run guitar, a mongrel, with parts from a Fender Telecaster and a Fender Esquire, both of a 1950s vintage. It had to have been the Tele, Springsteen told me, but he doesn't think there was an amplifier in the room. My recollection is it was straight into the TEAC. I think I maybe had an acoustic 12-string there. Yeah, and I guess I had a little mandolin somewhere. Harmonicas, of course, and then the glockenspiel. Most necessary, Springsteen said to me, laughing. But the glockenspiel was most necessary. I wanted that sound because it harked back to childhood, gave a sense of coming from that childlike space, Springsteen explained to me. I don't remember if there's glockenspiel used in Terrence Malick's Badlands, but if there's not, there's something in the instrument that reminds me of what's used on the film's soundtrack. That had something to do with me wanting the glockenspiel on Nebraska, and I think a few other songs. As I've said, I was kind of looking for some of the songs were coming from that Charles Laughton, The Night of the Hunter aesthetic, a really dark, twisted childhood fairy tale or folk tale that had a lot to do with why I wanted that glockenspiel sound. True to Springsteen's recollection, the Badlands score weaves Orff instruments throughout, the xylophones, marimbas, and glockenspiels associated with Orff Schwolwerk, a method and instrumentation for early childhood music education invented by the German composer Carl Orff. It was a sound that, for Springsteen, evoked both melancholy and a hint of menace. There's a bringing forth of the darkness of the natural world, Springsteen told me. If you watch The Night of the Hunter and see how it's filmed, it's a lot of images of the woods and shots like the classic close-up of the rabbit. Terrence Malick picks up on that in all his films, where the natural world plays such a big part, that meditative, that deadly meditative feeling of nature. It brings forth a sort of mythic dread. It's inherent in all the characters on Nebraska. So the TEAC 144 was on a table. The two Shure 57 microphones were on mic stands, one for vocals/harmonica and the others for the Gibson J200. There were a few extra cables and some pens and notebooks. The glockenspiel and the other percussion instruments were things lying around the house. Then it was just a matter of pressing play and record at the same time. Mistakes had to be egregious to stop the process. If a take felt lacking, he'd just do another, keeping them both. There wasn't a lot of listening back, mostly just moving ahead. The overdubs, though they were limited, were done in the same kind of loose spirit. Springsteen was thinking more about songs than recordings. For songwriters and record makers of Springsteen's analog generation, A psychological divide often separated the recording of demos from the recording of albums intended for release. Demo recording had little to none of the pressure of album making. In typical commercial recording studios, a red light would go on when recording was taking place. Singers, in particular, were known for losing themselves in the presence of those red lights. It was as if there was an ambulance in the room. Some singers thrive at an accident scene. Many don't. Those singers in commercial studios were also regularly isolated from everyone else, on the other side of some thick glass in a kind of performance aquarium. The idea was to deliver the best vocal possible, often with a group of people listening and watching from a control room, all prepared to pass judgment on a take, sometimes regardless of their qualifications. Thus the great struggle to keep label executives out of recording studios. A sensitive engineer in a commercial studio could light some candles, provide bourbon, maybe put up a poster of Brigitte Bardot, or give the rest of the band money to go play miniature golf just to get them out of there while the singer pushed out a vocal track. But the heightened self-consciousness of a final studio performance often remained. Cutting demos was far closer to the looseness of live performance, closer still to singing in the shower. You knew it wasn't for an audience. Being naked makes sense there. In those ways and others, commercial studios offered a marked contrast to the home demo environment, the end-of-the-bed world where Springsteen cut Nebraska. At home with his TEAC 144, Springsteen was just knocking songs off, making rough sketches, no one looking over his shoulder. He felt free, certainly not self-conscious, not under any kind of scrutiny. His goals were modest. The only things he might waste there in Colts Neck were a few bucks on cassette tapes in his own time. He was at liberty to explore the worlds of the songs rather than analyze his performances. His voice was different, not needing to fight its way through the sound of a band. It was probably beginning to strike Springsteen, as the recording started to accumulate, that the bulk of the material had certain family traits in mood, character, and musical feel. Mostly, the songs seemed to connect, asserting themselves as a collection. Springsteen had written some pretty dark songs along the way. Hungry Heart was like a study in human trouble, with only a few short verses, but no matter the song's content, as a pop production, it got Springsteen his first top 10 single and sent a clear message to the dance floor. It certainly isn't the case that people can only shimmy to happy songs, but the Nebraska material was different, or Springsteen was, or both. Once the recordings were done, even if they were just demos, they needed to be mixed down from the TEAC 144 to a standard cassette so that the music could be played back on any consumer device, in a car, on a stereo, wherever. Springsteen would need to mix them down to be able to share them with Jon Landau, with the E Street Band. In the midst of that process, Springsteen would, for the first time, hear the songs outside the experience of writing and performing them, as a listener. The mixing process was, of course, as casual as the rest of the recording, free from second guessing. Needing a cassette player to mix onto, Springsteen and Mike Batlin used Springsteen's Panasonic boombox, which was water damaged and had only recently started working again. Springsteen had been canoeing on the Navesink River with Gary Talent one afternoon when the boombox got hit with water over the bow. It seemed to destroy the thing. Springsteen didn't throw the machine out, though, and instead left it sitting on his couch, no proper burial, bachelor style. Then, weeks later, and very suddenly, while Springsteen was by himself and watching late-night television, it came back to life, playing whatever cassette had been left in it. It's a telling detail as far as revealing his ambitions for those home recordings. You don't master your recordings to a waterlogged Panasonic boombox if you're looking to follow up the river. But not only did Springsteen use the Panasonic for mixdown, he also, in the mix process, put all the recordings through a Gibson Echoplex, which put a layer of early Sun Records-style slap echo on, well, everything. Vocals, guitars, harmonica, percussion, glockenspiel. As decisions go, to mix every recorded track on a multi-track recording through a single effect is certainly not the kind of choice professional engineers tended to make when they were creating recordings for commercial release. But Springsteen wasn't thinking like a professional engineer. He just wanted a reference for the real recording process, something the band could listen to before they made a final version. Yeah, everything went through the Echoplex, he told me, laughing. Guitar, voice, everything. It all has that weird echo. When I said to Springsteen that I felt it ended up being a crucial part of the recording's character, he stopped laughing and nodded, agreeing that it was exactly right for the recordings, even if it was foolhardy. It was the right thing to do, he said. I have good instincts. I've always had good instincts. Sit me down in front of the elements and I'll put them together in a way that makes the most aesthetic sense. So that's basically what happened with whatever you want to call it, the mixing process of that record. Everything was done in 5 minutes. The sound I was looking for, we found it through the Echoplex and that beatbox. Much as the glockenspiel evoked a certain strain of childhood trouble, the anxious woods of the fairy tale world, the Echoplex, called to mind the sound of Elvis's early recordings. It transported the whole operation to a particular elsewhere. Springsteen elaborated. It's interesting, you know. Why are the Sun sessions Elvis's best? It's the spontaneity, that short echo. They've got a little Nebraska in them. Those records, they're pretty closely connected in some strange metaphysical way. I suppose the relationship would be in the characters, but also, without a doubt, in the sound. It's a disassociative sound. It's the sound of distance. It's the sound of the past, of history, in some way. It just brings all of that with it. When you really put slap on something, that particular echo, you're altering time and space. The echo effects were essential to Nebraska, which is one of the first things we messed up when we went to try and make it better. You're not going to mix a whole record through an Echoplex when you're doing a proper mix in a studio. But even the kind of echo found in a professional recording studio was too clean. Once again, we were gifted by our gear and the equipment that we were casually using at the moment. The tape that came out of the boombox mixdown had another unexpected quality, arrived at inadvertently. When taken to another cassette player and played back, it would play at a slower speed. The boombox might have been working, but it wasn't working perfectly. It was running fast, which meant that when the mixdown cassette was played on any other device, everything would be slowed down slightly, putting Springsteen's voice and music under another layer of gray. At first, no one even noticed, but the mood deepened. The cassette would go first to his manager, Jon Landau. Landau was a very different collaborator in style and temperament from anyone else in Springsteen's world. By that time in their relationship, when the recordings and a detached note got to Landau, the manager and the artist were deep into one of the great partnerships in American music, a collaboration that began in 1974 and continues today. Landau's reaction to the new recordings was immediate and unambiguous. He was, Dave Marsh writes, taken aback at the dark tenor of so much of the material. The tape, Landau told me, concerned him on a friendship level. Landau heard something, an anxious quality, that no one else would in the early stages of the project. His concern would prove justified. Chapter 12. How about we stop this? Warren Zanes. How would you describe what wasn't working when you went to re-record? Springsteen. Every step I took in trying to make it better, I lost my people. Warren Zanes. As though the characters of Nebraska had 51% of the vote, like they were going to say what this album was going to be. Springsteen. That's always the case, if you're doing it right. Warren Zanes. But these characters in particular were way out on the margins of life. These characters had a sound of their own. Springsteen. Yes. And so my job was simply to recognize that and not fuck it up. A mere 3 weeks or so after that January 3rd Colts Next session, and before Jon Landau got the tape of the home mixes, the E Street Band was at the power station, working on a different project, recording Cover Me, a song Springsteen was readying for Donna Summer. Landau, in the control room, listening back to the basic track of Cover Me, felt validated in his initial sense about the song, which came to him almost as soon as the band started working it out there at the studio. Cover Me was too good to give away. He'd lost arguments of this kind on several occasions, but that didn't stop him trying again. During the recording of Darkness on the Edge of Town, both Patti Smith's recording of Because of the Night and the Pointer Sisters of Fire landed high on the charts as Landau, Springsteen, and the E Street Band struggled to complete their own project. For Landau, it was at times a source of frustration. I think one reason why he never finished Because of the Night and instead gave it to Patti Smith was that it was similar to Fire. If it had been on the album, it would have been the song, the first thing everyone would gravitate to. The Pointer Sisters' Fire went to number 2, then Because the Night goes top 10. So both of those hits happened while we're still making Darkness. But Bruce was so rigorous in his view of albums as albums, he was protective of them, and big signals could affect that. The legendary engineer, mixer, and producer Bob Clearmountain, who would mix many of Springsteen's recordings, recalls another, later installment in that same general story. It was the first session for The River, which produced Roulette. New to the Springsteen team and unaware of the dynamics, Clearmountain was struck by what they'd recorded. After a playback of Roulette, he looked at Springsteen and said, "This sounds like a single." Behind Springsteen's back was Landau, making silent hand gestures to Clearmountain that said, No, don't say that." Clearmountain didn't know what was going on. Only later did he realize that, for the first time, he'd met an artist capable of worrying that they might be cutting a hit single. In the session that produced Cover Me, Landau, feeling sure that Springsteen was ready to make an album that could build on and exceed the success of The River, lobbied to keep Cover Me for the next album. That album had no name, of course. At that point, it had nothing but the song Cover Me, if Landau even had a chance of winning the argument. But for once, Landau got his way. Springsteen would give Donna Summer and her then-producer Quincy Jones another song, Protection. Cover Me thus took its place as the first recorded track for Bruce Springsteen's next release. In Landau's view, it was a promising start to the creation of what he hoped would be the big record he knew his artist had in him and deserved. Next, he just needed to hear what else Springsteen had been writing. If Cover Me was any sign, this was going to be all that Landau was hoping for. But shortly after recording Cover Me, Landau received the Colts Neck tapes with a handwritten note attached. Springsteen's note to Landau. "There's all sorts of stuff here. What I did is put anything on it I thought would be good for you to hear. I still left off about 5 to 7 things that I hadn't finished or really wanted the band to work out with. Many of the songs may need editing, lines changed, arrangements changed. Some will really work, others may just need to be put aside, but there was something in each one I got a kick out of, so it's included. I got a lot of ideas, but I'm not exactly sure of where I'm going. I guess the only thing I looked for in the songs was that it somehow break a little new ground for me. They all don't do this, some I just got a blast out of, but I think a good amount do, or at least try." At that point, he draws a stick figure with a guitar that says, "Let's rock." They may not hit you right away, or they may sound a little foreign. They were mostly all written, except Bye Bye Johnny, from the time we got off tour to right before Christmas, about 3.5 months. So here it is. 1. Bye Bye Johnny. No explanation necessary. 2. Starkweather or Nebraska, 4 mixes. Number 1 with 12-string, complete version. This song may need editing or verses switched, but it might be right as it is. This is about the Charles Starkweather murder spree in Nebraska in the 50s. Mix number 2, Early Fade. Number 3, Bad Harp, No Good. Number 4 with Glock. 3, Atlantic City, 3 different takes, all with slightly different arrangement and lyric changes. Number 1, take 1. Number 2, take 3. Number 3, take 4. This song should probably be done with whole band and really rocking out. Skip. This song comes number 6 on the tape. Johnny 99. 2 versions, kind of fun. These words are not completely worked out or finished, and so the singing is occasionally awkward. I don't know if this song is a keeper or not, but I thought you'd get a kick out of it. Number 1, take 2. Number 2, take 3, different end verse. 4, Mansion on the Hill, 3 mixes, and with slight balance change. / first 2 mixes are a little dirty. Third is best recording quality. 5, Born in the USA. You sent me the Paul Schrader script, which I did not have the chance to read yet, but I did whip up this little ditty, purloining its title. On this number, the song should be done very hard rocking. The song is in very rough shape, but it is as good as I can get it at the moment. It might have potential. 6, Johnny 99, see above. 7, Downbound Train. Up-tempo rocker for full effect needs band. Could be exciting. 8, Losing Kind. Searched and searched for a better title. Spent many hours on this task, but no good. I like the verses, but I can't seem to find a better punchline. Kind of like a James M. Cain story. Could be done with more of a band arrangement. 3 takes, all slight lyric changes. First and last verse. 9. State Trooper. I dreamed this one up coming back from New York one night. I don't know if it's really even a song or not, but I did it, so I figured I'd throw it on. It's kind of weird. 10. Used Cars. The exciting story of my own personal life. 2 takes. First is a little dirty recording-wise. Second, cleaner. 11. Wanda, Open All Night, in which the hero braves snow, sleet, rain, and the highway patrol for a kiss from his baby's lips. This song is very hard to perform. 2 takes. Second, more voice. 12. The Child Bride, in which the protagonist violates the Mann Act and is left to ponder his fate. This is kind of a work in progress, or more like without progress. I worked a real long time on this song and could never quite get it right. I spent so much time on it, I thought I'd include it to see what you think. 13. Pink Cadillac, self-explanatory. 14. Highway Patrolman. This is the same as Child Bride, and to a lesser degree, Losing Kind. Worked very long on this, and always had the feeling I was coming up short. Not really finished, but is about as good as I can get it at the time. Don't think the ending was quite strong enough. 15. Reason to Believe. No, not the Tim Hardin song, but a completely original tune by the same name, called from my own experience driving down Highway 33 on my way to Millstone. 2 takes. Second has extra verse. As Springsteen explained to me, he'd never come to Landau with a collection of songs on tape. In the past, he'd shared recently written material in the midst of recording sessions, or let new ideas emerge in that same context where Landau could witness a song's birth. He remembered, John was typically introduced to songs in the studio, so this is the first time I ever sent him a collection of them on a cassette. And I knew if I'm sending this stuff to John as my next record, he needs a little preparation. He needs an introduction of some sort, whether it's humor, whatever, he needs an entrance into it. I don't remember his initial reaction to the songs, but it might have been some puzzlement. That's what I was kind of prepared for, you know. This tape was something pretty different, but I don't remember our initial conversations. I made the package, threw a funny little note in, and sent it off. Because I knew myself that what was in there was very good. I had some inner feeling, some sense that something had happened that was going to need to be reckoned with on some level. Right then, I didn't think that that meant releasing it. I'm not releasing it, but it has to be dealt with. It's some part of my talent that I have to recognize and address. Springsteen's note to Landau serves as a clue to the cluelessness of the moment. No matter the level at which Springsteen was operating, firmly established as one of America's great songwriters, that note tells us that Springsteen either wasn't sure what he had or was worried that Landau might be, so his written descriptions of the songs pull away from the hopelessness captured in the songs. The joking tone of the letter rubs strangely against the tape's content. Communications between Landau and Springsteen would take different forms over the years. More recently, Landau remarked to me that Bruce loved to send text messages. In some periods, it was the telephone. But just then, with these songs, and in that technological window, it was a handwritten note with some almost extemporaneous thoughts delivered to Landau's office by a guy who drove in from Jersey. In that moment, Springsteen didn't have a lot more to say about the songs because he didn't necessarily know a lot about them himself. The cassette contained multiple mixes of several songs, and the note described the variations among them. The combination of levity and uncertainty in the written message suggests a songwriter in the middle of work, not done. For all the sense of presentation, Springsteen's comments are shot through with ambivalence, broad strokes, and misfires. You could have put question marks after a number of his statements. Highway Patrolman, he describes in the note, as coming up short, a song and recording that would later rank as one of his very best, exactly as it was. Landau listened, shared a few thoughts, and returned the tape to Springsteen. It was the only copy, so Springsteen needed it back. Sessions were booked for April, again at the power station, and the truth was that until then, Landau couldn't say a whole lot about the songs. The band needed to be there playing the material so Landau could hear them as they became fully realized recordings. The preliminary sketches on the tape couldn't tell him much about what the material would become as productions recorded professionally. When it came to working with Springsteen, Landau's experience of making records had often been one of expectations reversed, welcome accidents, failed efforts, unplanned victories. No one knows what's going to happen once recording begins. Like any other artistic enterprise, it's a process never fully in control of itself. The gods have the final word. A song could become 1,000 different recordings, and just because a good song is written doesn't mean a good record will come of it. So, for the most part, Landau held his thoughts in reserve. Come April, Springsteen returned to the power station, this time bringing the cassette as a reference for the sessions. He had it in his pocket, no case. There was lint on it. The E Street Band had assembled, and they worked with all the intention, energy, and expectation that album making requires. The trajectory of Springsteen's career was such that it would be foolish to do otherwise. On the second day of the sessions, it became clear that the tape had a few different things to tell them. The power station approach to Born in the USA was a significant departure from the Colts Neck demo. Max Weinberg's snare took on a central role, due in part to a gated reverb. It wasn't just that, though. It was the way in which that snare got the gift of space. A repeated synthesizer line and Springsteen's vocal were the only competing elements. In the intro, the first verse and the first chorus, all three, came to the fore while the rest of the band sat back. In Springsteen's productions to date, there was no precedent for what they were hearing in the control room speakers. This was not The River with the full band jumping on a song at the 4 count. It was a snare sound that demanded the others stand back and wait. Later, there would even be rumors that the drum was triggered, a sample. The music business has always generated plenty of rumors regarding human misconduct, but when there are rumors about a drum sound, that tells you something about the impact of a recording. You could say that it was the first time the influence of the digital age could be heard in a Bruce Springsteen recording, whether it was an analog recording or not. A Linn LM1 drum computer using digital samples had been introduced a few years earlier, doing its part to usher in an era when the snare drum could be isolated and brought up to new levels in a recording's mix. As a technological shift, it affected even those drummers still sitting at acoustic sets, playing to analog tape. The BBC's Neil Brand described the Born in the USA drum and synth sounds as taken together, something meant to pummel the listener into submission. Jon Landau recalls, "We had that drum sound on that record. Everybody wanted that sound for a while. Even to this day, you rarely hear drums with just the sonic power they had. It was so electrifying when we recorded it. It's an experience that was unforgettable. I forget a lot of the details of the past, but not that. When that happened, every person in the room, whoever was there, the assistant engineer or anyone in the band, everybody in the room felt like this is as good as it gets. It was a milestone. We'd done something in this studio that hadn't been done before. With that song, we captured some part of Bruce's thing that we hadn't up to that point. The greatness of the song wasn't revealed to me in the demo, wasn't something I heard until we were recording." Roy Bittan played his synthesizer riff on a Yamaha CS-80, hardly a tool of the garage band, and it would come together with Max Weinberg's snare to give the song its anthemic character and sonic currency. Few would be talking about Woody Guthrie when Springsteen released Born in the USA as a single. There was an energy that no one in the recording studio had planned on. Only a few takes in, and the band had the recorded version of Born in the USA that would eventually open the album of the same name. This is what Springsteen had wanted for all the Colts Neck demos to hit liftoff, but that's not what happened. If you were working on the new Bruce Springsteen project at the power station during the April-May sessions that year, you would have every reason to believe that things were going well, even very well. For a songwriter with Springsteen's output, it seemed there would always be more songs than needed. Completing albums for Springsteen typically involved the hard decision of saying what songs would be included and what songs would be shelved. That certainly wasn't the case for all acts. So, with Cover Me done already and Born in the USA arriving like an announcement that something bold and fresh and even daring was coming into being, who in the room was going to feel that things were not working? Only one person. As Toby Scott describes it, the recording sessions went quickly after that. Working on the Highway, a near-complete reworking of Child Bride, and Downbound Train came from the Colts Neck sessions. Both worked as band recordings. They were added to Cover Me and Born in the USA. 4 cuts, Darlington County, Glory Days, I'm Going Down, and I'm on Fire came next. They were not from the Colts Neck sessions, but were drawn from material Springsteen had available. Some written earlier, some more recently. That brought the total to 8. This meant that the lion's share of Born in the USA was ready to be mixed by the end of those 3 weeks at the power station. Toby Scott's gut sense was that Springsteen was uncomfortable with how smoothly, read quickly, the sessions were going. It could have been a celebratory moment. Why not? It was obviously a matter of perception. Scott saw it this way. The band went through, and after a period of experimentation as to how to play Born in the USA, they came up with a way to do it. As I remember it, the entire band played the song at the same time. That was the take. When they heard this back, we all went, "Whew, this is kind of a sound." I didn't know if this is what Bruce had in mind, but boy, everybody liked it, obviously. So we went on. Zipped through the recording. At least a song a day for a couple weeks. Then we did overdubs, then from Studio A up to the C room to mix. I started mixing, and then Bruce was like, "Wow, I think things were moving too fast for him. He tends to be very deliberate, likes to analyze stuff and make sure everything is how he wants it. And here we are, 3 or 4 weeks into the record, and we're mixing." He said, "How about we stop this?" Sitting on top of 2/3 of Born in the USA, including 5 recordings that would become top 10 singles, Springsteen was somewhere else. The record that was going to change his public life, that would make him one of the biggest stars in the history of popular music, was in 3 short weeks taking shape. But the record that was going to change his private life, his inner life, was the one that interested him, the one that compelled him, the one that woke him at 3 a.m. John Landau remembers the ambivalence Springsteen felt at the time. Bruce kept doing this dance between accepting and embracing the album he was making. They would have Born in the USA, they would have Glory Days, they would have Cover Me, the song that he wrote for Donna Summer and didn't send it to her because I said, "Please, please don't." I'd heard Born in the USA, and I felt it was some kind of hit. I didn't know if it was a top 40 hit, but I knew it was going to get people's attention. Glory Days, it felt like a smash. So he knew, in my opinion, that on one hand, he was onto something that could be really explosive and raise his profile as a mass artist. He had reservations about that, no secret, and he'd written this collection of songs, the Nebraska material, that was very independent, certainly not geared toward mass appeal. 2 extremes, same songwriter, same time. It's like he had his Star Wars and his art movie in his hand at the same moment, and he went to Nebraska first. It's just where he had to go. At the power station, they had tried various approaches in their efforts to record Nebraska, Highway Patrolman, Atlantic City, Mansion on the Hill, and the other songs that would make up Nebraska. In Springsteen's original note to Landau, he described material like Atlantic City as something that could work with whole band and really rocking out. But after trying just that, Springsteen changed his opinion. Whether with the full band, with just Max Weinberg and Roy Bittan, even performing the songs alone, nothing seemed to capture the spirit of the cassette recordings. Perhaps the most troubling detail was that the songs weren't even working as recordings when Springsteen played them solo. There was no band overpowering the songs then, so where did the songs go? Well, Born in the USA and Downbound Train rolled out with relative ease. The others, Nebraska, Highway Patrolman, Atlantic City, Reason to Believe, Mansion on the Hill, Used Cars, Johnny 99, State Trooper, and Open All Night would not yield. It seemed pretty obvious pretty quickly, Landau recalled to me, that this was not falling into place very easily. Bruce wasn't coming in the control room after the takes and high-fiving everybody. It seemed like it wasn't working. Now, at that point in the process, you could ask, Is this not working because these aren't the right songs? Or you could say, these are the right songs, but this is the wrong music done with the band. If your view was, we're making the next album, and these are the songs, well, they're not coming out very well. But again, you could look at it and say, look, are these even the right songs? Maybe we just need more rock songs, you know? But as I said, the songs on the tape, most of them, resisted intervention. Bruce had put months into the writing, and something was there. But for a time, we were unsure how to proceed. Nebraska and Born in the USA were eventually going to look like two halves of the artist's brain. But just then, there was no differentiating the material. It was all still one thing, a collection of songs for the next record, waiting to be turned into recordings. Springsteen took a closer look at what he had on the cassette, asked himself why it wasn't working when they tried to re-record it. Light. That was my judgment on the entire success of Nebraska, Springsteen told me at his Colts Neck home. What altered when we went in the studio was the light that was shining on the music and the listener. In the studio, we started to fuck with the songs because we fucked with the light tremendously. The slightest alteration really ruined it. The nature of the unbelievably basic equipment that we used was just unique. When you transferred it over, brought it up to tone, and raised the faders on the professional recording gear, that's what we screwed with. We screwed the light on the whole thing. Everything reflected differently. Sometimes the act of songwriting isn't an act at all. It can be sitting still, waiting, listening, asking questions of a song that's already, from one perspective, done. I went into the studio, Springsteen told me, brought in the band to re-record and remix those songs, and succeeded in making the whole thing worse. The characters got lost. The characters. Not only was he unwilling to risk losing the people of Nebraska, he was now going to go back and find them, get to know them better. As songwriters often discover and rediscover, just because you wrote it doesn't mean you know what the hell it is right away. But once Springsteen understood that the light of the recordings and the characters on whom that light shined were altered in the professional recording environment, he knew better what he needed to do. He needed to find a way to preserve those very things, the light and the characters. Only when he saw what the Colts Neck recordings couldn't be did he really begin to see what they were. And with that, the album that would become Born in the USA was officially put on the shelf, where it would languish for well over a year. The album of Born in the USA, Jon Landau told me, the dimension of it, the universal aspect of it that could take his career to a scale that was unprecedented for him, absolutely never would have come to exist without Nebraska. But I think he was the only one who saw that then, if even he did. Another aspect of the Colts Neck recordings that seemed to recede from view when the songs were re-recorded at the power station was the context and backdrop, the time when he made them and the America he felt around him when he pressed record. Springsteen wasn't involved in reportage, but he was out to capture the stillness, a certain American hopelessness he believed was obscured by the saturated colors animating President Reagan's vision of the country. Somewhere in the rough, unfinished quality of the recordings he located an otherwise hidden America, one he knew needed to be exposed. The Reagan era had ushered in a conservatism and hyper-consumerism. Deregulation allowed unchecked growth for already powerful institutions, and those who stood to benefit tended not to hesitate in taking what they could get. The divide between the very wealthy and the very poor would grow, and it would define American life in new and lasting ways. Springsteen's worry about the increasing distance between himself and the people he was writing about brought some urgency to the task of songwriting. Greil Marcus, writing during the River Tour, and also thinking of Reagan's election, felt the political situation in the United States would surely reveal itself in whatever Springsteen did next after the river. In a prophetic passage, Marcus insisted that it is an almost certain bet that the song Springsteen will now be writing will have something to do with the events of November 4th. Those songs likely will not comment on those events. They will, I think, reflect those events back to us, fixing moods and telling stories that are, at present, out of reach. When the songs from the Colts Neck sessions were eventually released as Nebraska, Many critics and listeners would believe, as Marcus had in his vision, that the material bore some crucial relationship to its political moment, whether that was there in the literal content or not. And when Springsteen finally spoke publicly about Nebraska, he wouldn't disagree. He would, however, make the point that the characters he had created, who seemed to whisper so many secrets about Reagan's America, didn't come from Reagan's America, even if their situations and struggles gave them a symbolic home there. In 1984, speaking about Nebraska with Hot Press, Springsteen said, "I just had a certain tone in mind, which I felt was the tone of what it was like when I was a kid growing up. And at the same time, it felt like the tone of what the country was like at the time. The characters, as he describes them, are from a then and a now. When the band fired up and those characters got lost, the songs stopped working as songs." And with that, both Reagan's America and Springsteen's childhood disappeared from view. "Sometimes the record or the film or the painting talks back to you," Jon Landau said to me, recalling this moment. "It's got its own voice if you're listening. With our efforts to re-record, something was not happening that was supposed to be happening. And in those moments, you can't will it into working. Bruce was still listening to those songs, even after writing them." After starting Born in the USA, Toby Scott recalls, "We had to go back and address the other songs he wanted to do, which were more single artist type songs. At first, Bruce would go out and sit on a stool and play acoustic guitar, singing those songs, and it just didn't sound like the demos. He got frustrated, and I remember there was a point in time when he told me, 'Don't come into the studio tomorrow.' That was about as close as one might get to the precise moment it happened. A decision was reached. And when Toby Scott came back to work, the focus had shifted." The failed attempts to re-record the songs threw Springsteen into a momentary uncertainty. Then, somewhere along the line, someone said, "Why don't you just put out those demos?" Maybe that cassette in his pocket, the one with lint on it that he'd been carrying around, was the record. Chuck Plotkin believes it was Jon Landau's idea to release the cassette, but Landau credits Springsteen. Steven Van Zandt says it was his idea. When I asked Springsteen about this tangle of credits, he just looked at me, smiled in a way that suggested such a tangle wasn't the first he'd seen, and said, "Ultimately, it would have been my idea. First of all, it wasn't something that someone else could say. Once you get to that place, that's kind of my decision. And so it was like, here it is. Nebraska made its own call. The music itself decided that it was going to come out as it was. Yes, there would have been a discussion about it. But obviously, like I said, I pulled it out of my pocket one day and I said, I think this is it." Chapter 13, Lost in Translation. But you have to make sure the technology doesn't outpace the humanity. It didn't matter if a studio was a shiny, state-of-the-art outfit or a raggedy little room whose jerry-rigged equipment was held together with tape and whatever else was on hand. Magic was laid down for the rest of the world to hear. Quincy Jones, Foreword to Temples of Sound. At what point did Bruce think, or had he thought all along, of making the demos into an album? Jon Landau asked, thinking out loud. Albums are more often found by trying things. They don't just appear. I'm not sure I or anyone could pinpoint the day Nebraska was found. It was a process. Part of that process, of course, involved getting to a point at which releasing the demos seemed a credible choice rather than a misguided one. I guess the thing that we're touching on, Landau continued, is how much we were acknowledging that putting out Nebraska, the Nebraska album, was such an unusual and unique thing to release, was actually a crazy thing to do. How much was there an original intention to do that, and how much did it just evolve? But just because Springsteen had pulled that cassette from his pocket and said, I think this is it, that didn't mean that the process was over. For a minute there, an idea came into Springsteen's mind. Why not make it a double album? Take the material destined for Born in the USA and build a second disc, a band recording, around that. It would be like two worlds with a spine connecting them, or separating them, depending on one's perspective. Born in the USA, that album, Springsteen tells me, initially came side by side with Nebraska. The first songs I cut for Born in the USA were Nebraska songs. I think I was coming off a stolen car out of that side of the river, those narrative stories. I was feeling like that was pretty interesting. So I was looking to sort of go in that vein for a while and see where it was going to take me. And it took me into the Nebraska record. Stolen Car, that probably could have been on Nebraska. It was close. Born in the USA came from that same period, but in time differentiated itself, at least as the full band version. That was just another thing altogether. The two albums were initially so oddly intertwined that separating them was, at least early, a significant part of the creative work. Much later, Springsteen would almost wish he'd left some trace of the interconnectedness of the two. One album, Born in the USA, would live under 100 spotlights. The other, Nebraska, would watch from the shadows. My big mistake, he insisted, was leaving the Nebraska version of Born in the USA off in Nebraska. I should have put it on there. I could have easily had it on both records. It would have made complete sense, and it would have been a fine part of the Nebraska record. It fit perfectly. Of course, that was thinking done in hindsight, and likely affected by the various, almost willful misinterpretations of Born in the USA that would, in time, celebrate the song as a patriotic anthem of some kind. Ronald Reagan's nod to Born in the USA and the man who wrote it is only the best known example of an interpretive effort that was, in effect, more like a hijacking. The applause was mighty, and Reagan's people were comfortable looking right past the world of trouble inside Born in the USA. Yes, they made a practice of looking past wreckage, but if Born in the USA had been on Nebraska, things might have been different. No flag on the cover, no snare to rouse a generation. But the double album idea didn't last long. No doubt that was due in part to some lingering double album fatigue. The river was still too close. Double albums, even the greatest among them, more often begin their lives as the solution to a problem rather than as an idea in and of themselves. But in solving one problem, double albums often created others. Springsteen didn't need to visit that place again. So a choice was made. Nebraska would end up being the only official release in Springsteen's catalog that was made without Springsteen's knowing he was making a record. That sound, the one of an artist unaware that he's making an album, couldn't be replicated at the power station. The sound of not knowingness, the sound of isolation, can't be consciously reproduced. If he had been sitting on the end of his bed in the Colts Neck rental, thinking he was making a record, everything, the mood, the mistakes, the voice, the mixing decisions, the time it took, would have been different. Springsteen was beginning to understand what he had, what those songs were, why they sounded the way they did, what had gone right. Springsteen, I had to lay myself way out there. I really had to do it. Mike was invisible in the room. It was like being there by myself. I had all the freedom that I needed, as if I was there on my own. That's how that record got made. Warren Zanes. Together with that firm knowledge that you were definitely not making a record. Springsteen, not making a record. That's very important. Warren Zanes, you'll never be able to reproduce those conditions. Springsteen, no, you can't do that. Warren Zanes, so the Ghost of Tom Joad will be a comparison, but it doesn't share that fundamental aspect. Springsteen, even if you got the same gear, that's just not the way it would work. It happened once, by accident. The second time you do it, the scene gets crowded with intention. What Springsteen didn't see coming, however, was the problem of translation, of getting the mixes on the cassette tape, which spoke one language, onto a piece of vinyl, which had its own mother tongue. A few machines would have to talk to one another across formats, and what would seem straightforward in that regard turned out not to be straightforward at all. It was an issue that would plague creators, as mediums, formats, and technologies would come and go with increasing regularity. The digital age would begin as a kind of pile-up. For weeks, the whole Nebraska album was, yet again, an uncertainty. It started to seem as if the recordings Springsteen had made were entombed in a cassette tape, inaccessible to anyone else. Chuck Plotkin would be put in charge of the rescue operation, but even weeks into that effort, he had found no solution. He went to Springsteen, nothing good to report. Plotkin remembers it as the only time he saw Springsteen appear to be crying. Chuck Plotkin was like many on Springsteen's team. He came in for a job he hadn't trained for, that of mixer, and then stayed. It was John Landau who brought Plotkin in a few years before Nebraska, maybe because Landau knew Springsteen even better than he realized. They needed someone to mix Darkness on the Edge of Town, and Plotkin wasn't a mixer. perfect. But it wouldn't have happened in quite the same way without Harry Chapin inadvertently playing a key role. Harry Chapin is best remembered for 1974's Cats in the Cradle, a melodrama in song form. It's not the kind of material or production that earned great love from music critics in the rock era. Jon Landau, then overseeing reviews at Rolling Stone, wrote one tough review of a Chapin project. After that, he assigned Chapin's recordings to other writers. I did see that he was doing this great work on the issue of world hunger, Landau explains, and he was a very charismatic guy, as I found out when he called me up and asked if he could come see me, which he did, bringing his guitar along with him. Despite the bad review, Chapin told Landau that he always liked reading the critics' writing, and now that Landau was a record producer, well, maybe they could work together. Landau listened to some of Chapin's material, but he knew he had the follow-up to Born to Run coming. Landau suggested that Chapin talk to Chuck Plotkin. True to his word, Landau then turned his attention to the project that would become Darkness on the Edge of Town. They were going to fight with that one for many months, well over a year. When they were finally ready to mix Darkness on the Edge of Town, by that time recording at the record plant, no one in the room was of one mind. Landau, Springsteen, Steven Van Zandt, Jimmy Iovine, they all had different ideas. We couldn't mix the record, Landau says. We were stymied. We were working on Prove It All Night, getting nowhere. So I got an idea in my head. I called Chuck Plotkin in L.A. His assistant at Elektra Asylum tells me Chuck is actually in New York. Oh, that's great, I say. Where can I get a hold of him? The assistant tells me that he's at the record plant, the studio we were sitting in, on the 10th floor, producing Harry Chapin. Making his way to the 10th floor, Landau found Plotkin and said he needed help. It was only 9 floors by elevator for Plotkin to unknowingly enter a new phase in his life and career, the biggest yet. Plotkin recalls the moment. Jon Landau comes to me and says, "Charlie, I could use your help with something here. We've been working on this record for quite some time. The record turned out to be Darkness on the Edge of Town. John tells me they're not finding the sound they're after. All we got is dull or shrill," he says. "We can't have dull or shrill. Would you stop by and just listen?" So I stop by. Everything's done. They're just mixing. And the person mixing at that point is somebody who was a much better mixer than I would ever become, Jimmy Iovine. But when I stepped into this project, when John asked me to come by, Jimmy looked like he belonged in a hospital. They were working these crazy hours, beating themselves up, trying to do something that they felt they were failing at. I said to John, "Okay, here's my story," Plotkin recalls. "You know I'm not a mixer. I know I'm not a mixer. I'm not even a recording engineer. If the tape on a multi-track machine rolled off at the end, I wouldn't know how to reload it. No matter." Landau, Van Zandt, Iovine, and Springsteen left Plotkin at the studio with the engineer, Tom Panuzio, giving Plotkin a couple of hours to come up with the mix of Prove It All Night. "We came back in," recalls Landau, "listened to Prove It All Night. Bruce turns to me and says, 'That's the best my music has ever sounded.' Plotkin, not one to sing his own praises, and this is an industry that's always breaking new ground in the area of self-aggrandizement, tells me that the solutions he arrived at in his mix weren't beyond the reach of the others, except that they were burnt," Plotkin insists, exhausted and frustrated. "I wasn't a Bruce fan," says Plotkin. "I'd never seen Bruce live. I wouldn't have recognized him on the street. This was about my relationship with John. Then the music took over." The next song was Adam Raised a Cain. This time, Springsteen, sitting beside Plotkin at the console, set it up. Bruce starts by saying, "This one's very different," remembers Plotkin. "Adam Raised a Cain was this dark, strange thing," he recalls. Bruce says, "Let me tell you a little something about this one." He wasn't going to sit through the entire process of mixing, but he wanted to set the scene. Part of what he must have realized was that I could have gotten the wrong idea for how to proceed with Adam Raised a Cain based on everyone's enthusiasm for how Prove It All Night sounded. He knew this thing couldn't sound anything like that and probably realized he needed to give me some assistance. "It's a movie," he tells me. "We're in a park. There's a couple, and they're deeply in love, very engaged with each other. It's dark. We're getting dark. And then, at some point, there's a shot cut to a mutilated dead body that's lying like 20 feet from where the couple is." He says, "I want you to think of this song as the mutilated dead body. I want the listener to experience that mutilated dead body every time they hear this." Chuck Plotkin quit his job at Elektra Asylum soon after. By the time of Born in the USA, he was listed among the album's producers. For Nebraska, His role was second only to Springsteen's. Again, it was Plotkin who would have to find a way to get the music recorded on the TEAC 144 onto vinyl. The CD era was beginning, but only just. For the most part, the audience was going to listen to Nebraska as an LP, if Plotkin could find a way to get it there. As a concept, moving recorded music from one place to the other seemed entirely plausible, like something that happened all the time. Part of what makes recording studios somewhat odd, a little museum-like in spirit, is that the gear of the past is not always rendered obsolete, even as the very latest technologies are welcomed in. A Telefunken U47 microphone from the 1940s is a favorite among artists across genres, still. A Fairchild 670 compressor from the 1950s, they can cost some $30,000 on the vintage market, is regularly used in the digital environments of today's best commercial studios. There is a mystical air about a Fairchild 670, Pete Townsend has said. Sorry, but that's a fact. Old technologies, mythic technologies, and the very latest gear mixed together in a way that is singular to recording culture. With the shift from analog to digital recording, the mixing of old and new would be ever more conspicuous and common. Imagine an office in which individual workstations have equipment from different eras. A typewriter in one, a Macintosh from 1985 in the next, and in the following cubicle, a MacBook Pro from 2022. It wouldn't happen. When the new stuff comes in, the old goes out. Computers, printers, copiers. In a recording studio, because different eras of technology do come together, a common language must be found. What made the TEAC 144 alien in the commercial recording environment, however, wasn't its age. It was its status as a consumer model. In the early 1980s, consumer and professional recording equipment had little in common and weren't created to interact. There was a caste system. Consumer and commercial gear didn't frequent the same joints. Chuck Plotkin. One of the things about Nebraska is it's cut on a crap piece of equipment. It wasn't a proper recording setup. It was also recorded by somebody who'd never recorded anything before, but they were making demos, so that wasn't an issue. Then at some point it becomes clear that our efforts to record the songs are not serving the material, that there's something magical about this demo Bruce has made. And we have to confront the fact that instead of carrying on trying some other approach to bring back the magic, maybe we have the magic. So what are we trying to do? I just had to make it releasable. But then we're in this situation where we bring a TEAC 144 into a professional studio. Toby Scott recalls the confusion of tongues. Bruce brought that 4-track machine in, and we had the guy from the power station modify it so we had 4 individual outputs. They transferred a bunch of these songs from the cassette onto 2-inch tape thinking maybe he can play along with himself. Nothing worked. The further we got into it, the more we discovered that there were too many variables and variations. The TEAC 144 presented Springsteen and his team with something as strange as they'd ever worked with. We had a lot of unique audio issues, Landau recalls. Bruce is walking around with a cassette, his follow-up to The River on it. He gave me the cassette when he wanted me to hear the songs. I didn't know what we were heading into. I played it and gave it back to him, and the thing just kept coming back. Then, when we agreed to work from the demos, they refused our efforts to transfer the audio in some fashion that made sense to us. The biggest name in American rock and roll, surrounded by a team as fine as any at work in popular music, and they couldn't get a thing past this cassette tape. Springsteen had already decided on releasing the music from the cassette, but even he imagined a process of cleaning up the audio. Now it seemed even that wouldn't be possible. Toby Scott remembers the return of the cassette. That's when Bruce is standing in the studio and pulls the cassette out of his pocket, holds it up, and says, "What's the chance of mastering directly from this?" At which point Chuck and John both groan, because here it was, mastering from cassette you'd buy at Walgreens. Bruce said, "What else are we going to do?" Even this much conventionalizing, trying to transfer the 4-track recordings to something better wasn't working, Plotkin explains. We'd done again what we did by going into the studio and trying to re-record everything with the band. We'd made everything clean, clear, lovely sounding, and it suffered. First we find we can't re-record it, then we find we can't even remix it. This didn't happen in an afternoon. We stopped remixing, Plotkin recalls, and this was already like weeks into the process. At that point, we have to acknowledge that the mixes are on that cassette of Bruce's. All the echo he put on will have to stay. I'm going to have to go in and master from that. Okay, so I knew I needed to go to Bob Ludwig, who's one of the very best mastering engineers, if not the best. The process of record making goes in those stages: recording, mixing, mastering. With this cassette, they found they couldn't intervene on the first two stages. There was one left: mastering. The mastering process involved equalization and compression, which could increase the clarity and power of a mix. Maybe there, Plotkin thought, the audio quality of these performances could be enhanced. Among the mastering engineers who handled the biggest commercial projects in the rock era, a few names would show up more than others: Greg Colby, Stephen Marcuson, Bob Ludwig. It made sense that Plotkin went to Bob Ludwig. I went to Bob, and he's not all that enthusiastic. It's going to have his name on it after it's all done, and people will be wondering what happened. It's still not going to sound like other major releases. Why would Bob expect Bruce's next record to come in on a cassette? But he did it for us. And what happened is it came back on disc. In those days, you would do the mastering onto a disc, and it distorted. If you listened carefully to the master, you could hear a kind of distortion. Somehow, the mastering emphasized this distortion. Word got back to Springsteen as various attempts were made to master the recordings. Once he decided that the mixed demos should be released, he'd gotten more and more set on the idea. Plotkin let Springsteen and Landau know that he'd keep trying. I think he had to go to 3, 4, maybe 5 mastering facilities, Toby Scott recalls. I know he went to Ludwig and out to L.A., to Steve Marcuson, and then he may have taken it to Bernie Grundman and maybe to Sterling. False hopes were sprinkled throughout the process. For my second stop, I went to a guy I trusted, Steve Marcuson. Good ears, Plotkin explains. He cuts a disc, and this time it plays back fine. It sounds great. We're listening back on a $17,000 turntable, so we're excited. I call Bruce, let him know I'll be back in New York in 2 days, that I've got some great news. But Plotkin, thrilled to be able to play Springsteen, a successful master, didn't play it back on a $17,000 turntable. I put the thing on for Bruce, Plotkin recalls, and it's crap sound in all the same spots as Bob Ludwig's master. Bruce is like, well, I'd known him for a while, and we were becoming friends, but I could tell he was fighting back the tears. Landau, hearing about the latest problems with the cassette, couldn't help but think about the fact that 2/3 of Born in the USA was sitting on the shelf as this quest unfolded. But he responded to Springsteen's unwavering commitment to the Colts Neck recordings, as did Plotkin. Chuck was meticulous and deeply attentive, Landau says. The word stubborn doesn't even begin to describe Chuck. He's outrageous. We have to take that into account when we're working with him. But Nebraska wouldn't have gotten made if Chuck hadn't kept at it. Bruce didn't say this after I played the second bad master, Plotkin says, but he was so clearly thinking, what the hell, I made this recording with my guitar, my own home equipment, and after weeks of trying to better it in a studio, we all have to conclude that not only are my home recordings more compelling than anything we're managing to do in the fancy studio, but now that we know that we have to use them, we can't. Now what? Do we throw them out? Finally, it was old gear that saved them. Atlantic Records had its own studio, but with the rise of independent operations like the Hit Factory and the Power Station, artists tended to use the label-owned studios less. Because of that, Atlantic's facility wasn't the busiest place in town or the most cutting edge. Where other operations upgraded to automatic lace for mastering, Atlantic had not. Dennis King, mastering engineer at the studio, still had to adjust the depth and distance between grooves on a disc by hand, the old way. But when he did, finally something worked. The old gear seemed to be able to talk to the cheap gear. The only hitch was that this worked only when the disc was cut at a low audio level, which bothered Plotkin far more than it bothered Springsteen. Years before, while mastering Darkness on the Edge of Town, Springsteen had to choose between keeping the long fade he wanted on Racing in the Street or having equal audio levels on both sides of the album. He chose the long fade, leaving one side of Darkness slightly quieter than the other. Springsteen's response, they have volume knobs, right? We had no choice, Plotkin recalled. That's all we could do. We had to cut this at an incredibly low level so that the needle wasn't digging too deeply into the material, the vinyl, way lower. Landau stood somewhere between Plotkin and Springsteen. Well, I feel sure that Bruce himself didn't care about the record being quiet. Chuck cared because, as a professional, he wanted the record to have strength. He wanted this so that when a person at home is playing records and Nebraska comes on, that person doesn't feel like they have to raise the volume to make it on par with the record they were just listening to. Thinking of the cassette tape that took over his life for a time, Plotkin recalls the anomalous nature of the thing. The strange choice of instruments, the strange sound of his voice into this microphone, the strange sound of cassette tape mixed to a cassette tape, 2 generations of cassette tapes. Whenever I talked to John, he assured me, this is going to get put out without a single, and it's going to be without a tour. We're in there making the next rock record right now, and it's going to be an important release. But in the meantime, Bruce has made this. Keeping that in mind was obviously important. We had to trust Bruce and see that bigger picture. Years later, it would seem Nebraska was the pulling back of the bow, and Born in the USA was the era's release. But that 1-2 effect was, just then, still only a feeling, an article of faith. For Plotkin, it was a lesson in who this artist was. This experience was different from any he'd seen in his long career. Bruce was not simply brave enough to do this sort of thing, but was compelled to do this sort of thing, Plotkin said. What an artist has to do to keep himself alive as an artist is to not get stuck. Bruce was always more concerned about whether or not he could maintain an authentic relationship to his own experience and to his audience than whether this sold or reached this number on the charts. At some point, he had more money than he could possibly do anything with anyway, unless he was going to give it all away, but he grew up too poor for that. From what I remember of being close enough to the heart of what was going on at that time in the artistic and personal realm was that he, and it's always hard all these decades later to remember for sure if this is how he voiced it or if this is how I sensed it, but he actually found himself saying that this was the first completely honest piece of work that he'd ever done. And at that point, he was looking back on some very good stuff. But he had this sense that he had never caught the thing by its tail. Even I would have people come up to me at shows after the release of Nebraska, complete fans. I don't even know how they recognize me, but they'd come up and say, "Oh God, this is the music." The various producers involved with the previous few albums, Landau, Plotkin, Springsteen, and Steven Van Zandt, were all connected with Nebraska in some way, but none of them would be credited as producers. Retrospectively, Landau says, I would say that a record which had such a special way of coming into being, well, that even Pudding, produced by Bruce Springsteen, didn't feel right to Bruce. There's certainly nobody else you could give that title to, but even Bruce didn't take it for himself, so there's no producer. One of the things Plotkin insists is that it's an acknowledgement that there's something precious about Bruce being able to work in an environment where, hey, there's no real equipment. He's writing about the middle of the night, and he's singing about it in the middle of the night, all by himself. He's not evaluating his performances, he's just blowing it out. That's Nebraska. It's like the battle to expose. That business of the authenticity of the experiences he was reporting on is critical. There's some complex thing at work in the relationship between an artist and himself, an artist and his audience that just, it's wild, it's challenging. I'd never see it again like I saw it with Nebraska. With a completed master, it was now time to take it to the record label to tell the executives, here's the next Bruce Springsteen release. Rough home demos, mastered at a low level, no singles. First track is about a serial killer. No tour or press. If you could make a list of the things a record company does not want to hear.